Mata, for the good offices that you give us all. I think the best way to introduce Udi, Adiv, is to talk about how I see him as a younger scholar and activist. In this case, the best words to describe Udi are the ones penned by longtime Israeli revolutionary Moshe Moshe when he eulogized the Palestinian revolutionary Jabra Nicola. He says he had gone through the earlier history of the world revolutionary movement. He remembered from his experience things we knew only from books. In particular, a vital period of the Zionist colonization process was for him a living memory. Adiv's biography is a meeting point of historical movements, both globally and locally. Udi's thinking was shaped by the ferment of the 1960s in the United States and in Western Europe. Like others in the West who sought to reinvigorate the Marxist project of liberation, tainted by Stalinist crime, Adiv radicalized the Shomer HaTzair Marxism by turning to Marxist anti-colonial thinkers. Those were intermediate to him by Ilan Halevi, that brought to the Israeli radical leftists of the early 1970s the stress on the third world nationalist liberation movements. Another context in which Adiv's lives unfold is local and intimately connected to Palestine-Israel, Israelis and Palestinians. The 1967 war shaped Adiv's generation. Most Israelis drank the intoxicating brew of nationalism in the wake of the stunning victory. Others, like Adiv, the paratrooper, were stunned by the unfolding occupation of Palestinians. He came across the Palestinian people trailing on the side of the Jerusalem-Jericho road. The moral indignation aroused by this meeting and the occupation led him to the Israeli Socialist Organization, or in short ISO, known by its newspaper name Matzpen, campus in Hebrew, and the ill-fated 1972 Arab-Jewish espionage ring. Yet another setting that underpins Udi Adiv's life is his kibbutz, Gan Shmuel. At the heart of Zionist socialism, he was shaped by Shomer HaTzair's unique blend of Zionism and Marxism. But even in this center of the most universalist ideological utopia of Zionism, the colonial reality underlying it was part of Adiv's upbringing. Less than 2 years old, he was awoken in the kibbutz dormitory when explosions shattered the nighttime silence. These were the kibbutz members blowing up the deserted houses of the depopulated village of Khirbet al-Sarkas. When one child asked the nanny, who rushed to comfort the startled children, where the Arab neighbors would live when they returned, the nanny explained that the houses were being demolished to disuse them from doing so. It is no coincidence that as a young soldier, the view of the second wave of Zionist ethnic cleansing pushed the young Adiv to anti-Zionism. Still, there is yet another aspect of Udi Adiv which links all of his varied life experiences, the one of the thinker and the scholar. We will debate in detail the political and historical thinking of Adiv later. Here I want to place Adiv within the left's thinking in Palestine-Israel. The radical left in Palestine-Israel had to respond, since it emerged in the early 1920s, to two strong national movements, one native and anti-colonial, and the other colonial. Communists of different stripes analyzed and tried to form an answer to Zionism and Palestinian nationalism, an answer that will create a space where the two peoples of the country can live together in peace. This process of thinking produced the basics of the criticism of Zionism. Leftists in Palestine, Israel were the first to describe the colonial nature of Zionism, understand its organic link to imperial projects in the Middle East and the globe, and uncover the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in the pivotal year, 1948. Beyond this critical thinking lies one fundamental question: how the anti-Zionist left should contend with Zionism, a settler colonial movement that dispossessed the native people of the land, and at the same time, a movement carried out in the name of the victims of anti-Semitism and genocide. expressing the same victims' dreams and hopes, all while enacting a racial colony for Jews only. A movement that parts of it professed high moral and progressive ideals as they practiced the robbery of their neighbors' land. The way we, as Jews who oppose the dispossessing and colonial practices of Zionism, should relate to its continued presence is the question before us tonight. And there is no better one qualified to guide us through these difficult and complex questions than Adiv. Okay, thank you, Udi.
Yes, okay. So thanks for all the interesting introduction about me. It's more or less true. Okay, so this is what I would like to present here is somehow it's an end of, not end, but more advanced conclusion of long studying and reading and involving in this question of Israel-Palestine. And the first things to highlight maybe here that people that in Israel, I never use the word the Jews because Israelis are okay, they are also Jews, but they have nose and they have other some common characteristic with other people, but they are mainly Israelis, like the Canadians and the Australian and the American are no more British or French. So the question is the Israelis and the Palestinian. The Jews are in Canada, it's a different story. They can think whatever they think and identify as themselves as such. But in Israel, it's insisting of always using this term of Israelis. And I think it's important. Okay, let's start my speech. The history of Zionist movement is a story with unhappy outcome. It began with a vision establishing an ideal national Jewish society. It resulted in a bloody conflict and evolving into an ongoing war against the local Palestinian people. Given the initial Zionist socialist idea, it was indeed a tragic end in the classical Greek sense, a predestined failure in the face of predetermined reality, because it was an inevitable consequence of the imminent incongruity of the Zionist idea itself, the contradiction between the Zionist premise of Jewish revival in the Jewish homeland as a telos of centuries-long galut exile, and the means to this end, the implementation of settler colonial project in Palestine. An additional contradiction was a Zionist attempt to amalgamate enlightened universalist idea of romanticism, liberalism, and socialism with the ethnocratic, anti-republican, Central and East European inspired principle of exclusivist ethnic religious Jewish nationalism. This contradiction lies in the core of the conflict with the Palestinian and continues to be its main driving force ever since. Indeed, the concept of Zionism is emerging from writing of Echad Ha'am, Martin Buber, and the socialist writer of Poalei Zion Small, the Zionist worker of the left, could have been interpreted in light of that enlightened tradition. However, with the establishing of the State of Israel, by means of fire and sword, it became clear that this was no longer the case. The Zionist Yeshuv, so it's a Zionist Yeshuv, not a Jewish Yeshuv, as a modern colonial settlement project had already constituted a radical break with its enlightened European tradition. And it ought to be discussed in terms of our world, our time, i.e. its action and its impact on its specific geographical and historical context. Given the eventual unhappy outcome, we must ask ourselves what were the cause and the meaning of the failure of the original Zionist idea. The Zionist idea of Jewish national revival was initially posited as a righteous spiritual reward for the suffering of East European Jewry. This idea took on the characteristic of a secular religion, which appealed to the Jews who were faced with hostile anti-Semitic society and state apparatus. Over time, however, it was transmuted into a collective sentiment and general will of the Zionist Yeshuv in Palestine, sublimated through their attitude toward the indigenous Palestinians in a manner which has exacerbated the conflict to this day. Having said that, despite the apparent of conformity and continuity, one can discern a clear dividing line. This is the main point that I would like to highlight. And despite all this introduction, what I would like to say, that one can discern a clear dividing line splitting the Zionist movement. On the one hand, there was an ideological and political antagonism between the left-wing Zionist parties. It was the four political leftist parties, such as Mifleget Poalim Sozialistit, MOPS. As of 1923, it became Communist Party. Poalei Zion Small, that I already mentioned them. Gduda Avoda, the Labor Battalion, and Hashomer HaTzair, the young guard, or Mapam later on one hand, and the ruling Mapai party, the Liberal Zionists and the Proto-Fascist Revisionist Current on the other hand. We cannot therefore perceive and consider Zionist movement as a unitary entity, ideologically and politically. My contention is that this internal contradiction are what distinguish the Zionist movement and stand in contrast to the bulk of its critiques. During the 60s and 70s, now this is a general introduction. Now it's the main, where I stand between the critiques and what I call the apologetics. Apologetic writer, During the 60s and 70s, writer of what I term the neo-Zionist school gradually came to the fore. Members of this school comprising writers such as Shlomo Avneri, Shmuel Eisenstadt, Anita Shapira, Gorny, and so forth, and even Zev Sternhal, were the privileged offspring of Zionist Yeshuv, raised as a master of the land, and had not shared the harsh experience of East European Jewry. My principal criticism of this writer is that they ignore the wisdom of hindsight, which according to Hegel rises only when dusk is falling. They could be expected to display a better understanding of the historical process which spelled the tragic outcome of the Zionist dream. Moreover, 67 war, ensuing war and ensuing occupation of the Palestinian territories completely negated the remnants of the perception of Israeli state as the embodiment of Jewish self-determination. Anita Shapira, what Anita Shapira called the Jewish defensive ethos of Zionism. The works of the historian Anita Shapira could represent this new Israeli orientation of Israeli historiography following 67 war. As Shapira put it in the introduction to her first book, which was published in 1977, the subject matter of her research is a history of social and political relation within the Yeshuv during the 30s. However, I could not overlook that what she said, it's a quotation, the connection between the struggle for Hebrew labor and the relation between the two people in the country. Shapira did concern about the relation between the two people in the country, even though her book were still loaded with what Kolat, the historian Israel Kolat, called the Zionism subjective meaning. As a result, the general impression of her studies is quite apologetic. In 1992 was published probably Shapira's most apologetic book, Cherev Hayonah, the dove sword, the Zionist resort to force. On the whole, the book, by virtue of its title, is an attempt to explain why and how a movement of what Shapira called revolutionaries who look for the way to realize the two elements, the socialist and the national, eventually lost its revolutionary spirit and transformed into quite a militaristic society. The book is mainly an apologetic attempt to describe and explain this transformation. Certainly, Shapira argued it was not the fault of the early Zionist revolutionaries, quote unquote. It was just the violent Arab opposition to the Zionist Yeshuv which gradually forced the labor movement to endorse the offensive ethos, what she called offensive ethos. Thus, all along her monumental book, Shapira uses the Zionist idea of Jewish defensive ethos is a major explanatory category to describe the general viewpoint of early Zionist Yeshuv toward the indigenous Palestinian people. For that reason, she hardly referred to any concrete military operation which was committed by the Zionist Yeshuv against the Palestinians. As she explicitly said, that her book is not about facts, but rather a new interpretation of the fact. Zionism, Shapira explained, was a national movement which found itself in a colonialist circumstances, which obliged it against its will to adopt bellicose orientation towards the indigenous Palestinian people. As claimed by Shapira, this duality of national movement and European colonialist movement characterized Zionism ever since. Yet at the beginning, during the 30s and 20s and 30s, the old guard of the Zionist labor movement highlighted the internal progressive emancipatory message of Zionism and consequently managed to curtail its aggressive orientation toward the Palestinians. The Zionist labor movement tried as much as possible to calm the tension between the two people, in the hope that eventually it would be possible to establish in the country a Jewish entity by peaceful means. Moreover, she argued even in the later years, until the 1948 war, the Zionist leader continued to give credence to the defensive ethos and tried to avoid violent confrontation with the Palestinians. Nonetheless, during the 40s, when the confrontation was viewed as inevitable, they invented the doctrine of en brera, no other option, as a moral rationale for their new belligerent attitude. Eventually, Shapira explains the adoption of the offensive ethos as the rationale of en brera during the 40s occurred as an inevitable consequence of historical circumstances in spite of the inherent pacifism of the Zionist movement. The fear of a new Holocaust, this time in the land of Israel, which would obliterate the last remnant of the Jewish people hope, was a permanent factor in en brera during the 40s. This time they were the Jews who asked for subduing, and they were also ready to risk war and life and death with all its consequences. Shapira focuses here on what she called the immanent Jewish motive, namely the fear of a new Holocaust, is a major factor which stimulates an advocacy of the new belligerent ethos during the 40s. In addition to the fear of new Holocaust, Shapira equally acknowledged the advocacy for the offensive ethos during the 40s reflected the right of the young generation of the Zionist Yeshuv, what she explained, the Palestinian-born generation, which was free from the Jewish mentality and consequently from the Zionist first-generation defensive ethos. For 9 pages, Shapira constructs This differentiation between the East European Jewish ideological perspective of the parent generation and the aggressive Eretz Israeli orientation of the son generation. Eventually, Shapira concluded it was the Eretz Israeli generation, realistic orientation that prevailed over the East European Jewish mentality of the Zionist old guard. Shapira idealized the founder father of the Zionist labor movement, whom she suggests represent the emancipatory, enlightened essence of Zionism. Shapira's book is characteristic study of the writer of the Neo-Zionist school. Her numerous books represent the more realistic Eretz Israeli orientation of the Zionist study. Thus, at the end of the book, the Zionist attitude is not defined anymore in terms of Jewish defensive ethos, but rather as a movement of young settlers who define themselves as us against the other. Yet, Shapira fails to notice that the principle of the Jewish defensive ethos was still just the brighter side of the Zionist movement, which defined itself from the beginning as an exclusivist nationalism separately and against the Palestinians. As I have already said about Gordon, Ade Gordon and his follower in his party, Hapoel Hatzir, as they indeed settle in Palestine, not by the way of the powerful, but rather in the creative spirit of the real life. The quotation. Nevertheless, even in their romanticized Zionist outlook, hides the seed of the predicament that sparked the historic conflict with the local Palestinian people. It was this irrational nationalist essence of Zionism that sooner or later would trigger the conflict with the Palestinian people and has continued to be its main driving force ever since. Thus, as Shapira showed during the 40s, the most explicitly during the 48 war, it was the same Zionist leadership which already felt strong enough to adopt its offensive ethos and eventually to disempower the indigenous Palestinian people. So it's not the young generation versus the old generation, but also the old generation still adopted the moment he could make it, adopted the offensive essence. This is why she related to the Zionist militaristic attitude as an exception or as a denial of the former. For that reason, her book is actually an apologetic attempt to rationalize the Zionist offensive as just as a belated manifestation of Zionism. Yet judging Zionism in terms of ethical responsibility, it's precisely its militaristic attitude which matters rather than its initial Jewish defensive convictions. So by this, I'm now going to criticize the post-Zionist critique. By the late 80s, against the background of the prolonged ongoing occupation of Palestinian territory, critical works of the post-Zionist school started to appear. These works present Zionist Israeli society as it is in reality, rather than as an idealized realization of the Zionist idea. These writers, such as Shafir, Pape, Kimmerling, Yiftach El, and Zand also, and Azulay and Ophir, I believe that the difficulty with the Israeli critical thought as presented in the not altogether unbiased historical and sociological study is threefold. Methodologically, the failing is what Quentin Skinner called a mythology of foresight, namely the hindsight knowledge of the outcome of Zionist movement serves as an analytical criterion to evaluate the Zionist movement in its entirety from its inception. Historically, it is clear for all to see that the bulk of the Zionist settlement in Palestine was realized by the Zionist labor movement, a movement generated and incubated within the Russian revolutionary movement, rather than by imperialist colonial power. Politically, the issue is that of the perspective. What are the reader supposed to do with the depiction of the Zionist movement as a chronicle of the foretold tragedy of the Zionists as a settler colonialist and the colonized Palestinian people? In the absence of a more complex understanding of the Zionist movement, they unwittingly assist to empower it, simultaneously as an anti-Zionist critique. They completely rejected it as if things never happened, and this option is still open to us. A good case could be Gershon Shafir's book, Land, Labor, and the Origin of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. I just confess that 30 years ago, when the book was published, I was a student and I was very impressed by this book. But after more learning and studying, I realized that the difficulty with this idea. By its title, is an attempt to redefine Zionist movement as a specific case of colonialist settlement. Accordingly, as it is, Zionist movement was quite certainly not a uniquely Jewish gathering, and in fact, it should be defined by way of comparison with other colonialist societies. Thus far, the Zionist socialist writer emphasized the separatist exclusivist nature of the Zionist Yeshua, since there was no exploitation of the local by the settler. Shafir, in opposition, argued in this regard that the Zionist movement worked on the prototype of pure settlement colony. According to it, the employer and the employee belong to the settler population. As such, colony of this type allow its residents to regain a sense of cultural and ethnic homogeneity associated with the concept of European nationalism. United States, Australia, New Zealand are examples of this type of colony. However, unlike the latter, in Palestine there was not plentiful of land at a nominal price. In addition, the Zionist movement had no military power of one of the European powers that could enable it to conquer the territory by force. Subsequently, they employed to employ the local labor power under slavery or semi-slavery conditions. In view of their limited resources and military power, the socialist leader of the second Aliyah developed the new model of collective and cooperative settlement, namely the kibbutz and the moshav. Such a model, which developed gradually after the failure of the plantation colony, which implemented by the settler of the first Aliyah. This first Aliyah, second Aliyah, it's all in quotation because I never use this Aliyah as the first wave of immigration. The new Zionist model of pure settlement colony was introduced by Otto Warburg, Oppenheimer, and Arthur Ruppin, the German member of the Zionist executive. Such model, which implement in view of the experience of the Prussian colonialism in the territories annexed by Prussia in the east and was settled by majority of the local Polish population. That being so, according to Shafir, it was the invention of the kibbutz as an ultimate manifestation of the pure Zionist settlement, which inevitably instigated the historical conflict with the local Palestinian people, and as it was the Zionist original sin. The settler colonial paradigm of Gershon Shafir looks indeed quite radical among the other paradigms that were mentioned by Uri Ram in the book. This was taken from my book anyway. Primarily because, unlike Smocha and Biletzki, examines the Israeli society as a consequence of its historical conflict with indigenous Palestinian people, rather than as an exclusivist Jewish society in and for itself. Yet the main problem with the colonialist perspective of Shafir lies yet again in the very definition of his positivist sociological paradigm as an attempt to show what Zionist history really was, whereas a critical writer should have related as well to the Zionist thought rather than to the Zionist might. Unfortunately, such a critical perspective is quite absent in Shafir's positivist analysis. Moreover, in terms of the positivist neo-Marxist paradigm, it is an attempt to apply the Procrustean bed of monarchic colonial paradigm on the totality of the Zionist historical process. Since Adiv Shafir put forward the economic base as a driving force and the ultimate end of the Zionist movement. Indeed, it is quite true that the kibbutz played a major role in the development of the colonial base of Zionism. Yet, as I've tried to show, the kibbutz in my book that's missing here, the kibbutz was not just a pure settlement colony, it's a unique case of the European colonialist project. It was at once a socialist community, such a community which tried to introduce as well universal socialist idea into its exclusivist colonial project. The tragedy was that eventually during the crucial year of 48 war, the Zionist Yishuv casted aside its socialist enlightened spirit and subsequently its colonialist military rule did prevail. Accordingly, during the early year of the 40s, the kibbutz turned as well into military base, part of the kibbutzim, not all of them, military base for the Palmach units, the main Zionist militia, which eventually decided the fate of 48 war, by means of which the state of Israel was established. To sum up, so it seems that in opposition to the colonialist paradigm of Shafir, precisely in the case of Zionist movement, they were the ideology and politics rather than economy that was a driving force of the historical process. For that reason, the difficulty is that in view of the above, Shafir attributed too much substance to the economic base of Zionism and subsequently underestimate the complexity of its subjective, ideological, and political motive. Ralph Miliband criticized in his writings the original Marxist view regarding the role of the state. According to him, the difficulty with Marx is that he regards the state as an historical, not as the state as an historical subject, and so it disregards as an historical subject, and saw it just as an object of processes and forces at work in the society. Similarly, to paraphrase Miliband, so it seems that Shafir too views the Zionist movement only as an object of processes and forces at work in the society, rather than as an historical subject in and for itself. The approach presented in my books begs to differ. It suggests a way forward by addressing the historical development of the Zionist movement from its inception, while trying to highlight the enlightened socialist element within it, from its inception to the current day Israeli society. My conclusion is that post-48 Israel society should be recognized for what it is, not as a Zionist entity, but as it was from its inception to the present day as a multi-faceted movement and society ridden with internal conflict and contradiction, one that could be changed so it will not be no longer Jewish nationalist and occupying as it currently is.
Thank you so much, Udi. We were going to turn it to Amir first, but he's having technical difficulties. And while that is happening, I will explain to folks how our question period and comment period for today will work. So basically, we have a lot of people on this call. So I will reactivate the chat in a little bit, and you can put your comments and questions in the chat. And myself and Marta will do our best to make space for all of the questions and comments. It would help if you indicate which of the presenters your question is for. And just so that the folks know, to ensure equity and inclusivity of today's event, we will select questions based on the principles of gender diversity and equity. And finally, I will say that should we disagree, let's do so respectfully and positively and in good faith, because this is part of the IGV principles of conversation. And also, let's try to be as accessible as possible in our questions to people who might be new to the issues. All right, so while we are waiting for Amir to rejoin us, I will reactivate the chat so that folks can start putting their questions in. But does anybody present has a question? Marta seems to have a question. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I got a question from an attendee during the presentation, and it's towards Udi, towards you. This person says they would love to hear your personal story and experience, I guess, in the Israeli left movement.
So it's shall I answer? Yeah.
Please do.
So it's quite a long story, but it somehow certainly relates to what I said, because I, in the beginning, after the 67 war, I became very, again, very critical, and it was also my mood was very angry. So I completely rejected and negated the whole kibbutz idea that was that what I said, what I thought, that they are hypocrites. They just pretend to be progressive Marxists, but actually there's no difference between them and the mainstream Mapai. But then later on, I realized that it's not as simple as that. And they are so. But personally, I was very convinced until 67 war. I was 100% leftist Zionist. I believed that this synthesis could work, could function. And the kibbutz, in my opinion, I regarded myself as a quite progressive socialist, Marxist. And I thought the kibbutz, the realization of this idea. And there was no war, there was no conflict. The last war was 11 years before in Sinai, and I blame Ben Gurion and Dayan for this war. And so I thought it could be, the Nasser could be, we can make peace with Nasser, we can settle the Palestinian problem with some turning of some refugee. And then came 67, it was quite a shock. It was overnight, it was quiet, it was the most quiet year in the history of Israel, this war between Sinai operation and 67. And since then, the left is, all the rest is history. Then I left the kibbutz, I joined Matzpen, and also Matzpen was not quite radical for me. So I met one Palestinian activist in Haifa who belonged to the Communist Party, and he left it. And he said that he has connection with the Marxist from the PLO, some activists in the Palestinian Marxist organization. So through him, via him, we make a contact, and there is a group of 25 people, 4 Israeli and 20 Palestinian Israelis. And we try to organize a group that will somehow work together with the Palestinian in a not exactly clear way. But I thought that if the revolution will not come from within, it will come from outside by the combination or working together between Israelis revolutionary and the Palestinian movement. And nationalism was the main driving force, in my opinion. I left this dogmatic Marxism that the only revolutionary agent is the working class, the European working class. But then very soon, 2 years later, we all caught by the Shabak, and then I spent quite a lot of years in prison. But the most important, the most important in terms of my political education and understanding, and was in prison, because in prison I met all the Palestinians, the Marxists and the nationalists and the religious, and I somehow realized to what extent it's not as simple as that it's not enough to be Palestinian in order to be revolutionary, and that I can agree with you that there is so it's much more complicated to change the Israeli situation. So after 12 years in prison, I went back to the university, and then I studied in the doctorate about the Zionist literature and this apologetic historian like Anita Shapira. And later on, I realized that it's even more complicated. It's not enough just to criticize apologetic, but also somehow the post-Zionist, and I mentioned some names that they went too far with this negation for the sake of negation, is critique for the sake of critique, and just describing the history and the occupation and the ethnic cleansing. It's not enough if you don't immediately add some way to what to do with this. How can you sort out this conflict? Because we have already, and in this case, I don't see a big difference. I already somehow mentioned in the case of when I talked about criticized Gershon Shafir, that in many ways Israel is not different from United States, from Australia, even from Canada. It's 100 years. You cannot, and what is done cannot be undone. And the only way is to, not, the question is not how much Secleton you have in this cupboard, and everyone, but how you would deal with this society in such a way that it will be inclusive and not exclusive on the, because this is the whole problem. The main reason for the conflict is the exclusiveness of Zionism, and you cannot respond to it, but Arab exclusivism, or and I think that there is lots of potential. Israeli society now is very alive, and lots of discussion and criticism, and lots of complaints, and underprivileged and oppressed part of the population. So in the right way, you can canalize this energy to the right way, and mainly towards the Palestinian. And this is, as I see maybe there's what is I can maybe among the very not so many Israelis that can make or appeal to the Palestinians in such a way that they can convince them that not from the privileged position, but from side by side by them, and to somehow to find a way how to change the Israeli society from within, and not to expect that somehow the world will save us. It will never happen. Also in South Africa, it's true that the world put a pressure, but if the ANC would not present such a enlightened and civil perspective for the white, they would never agree to somehow to be excluded from the solution. They should be inclusive, and so this is that's why I came back to the Zionist story, in order to give some material, or to somehow to substantiate my present political position.
Thank you so much, Udi. We got Amir back on the call with us. So before we go back to the question period with the audience, I would like to turn the microphone on to you for any and all conclusion you wanted to do for the presentation part.
Is it me again? Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm sorry, the computer just went dark. I don't know what happened there. Okay, I'm gonna answer basically with sort of a rejoinder to Udi and to I'm not really going into the weeds of different schools of scholars and intellectuals in Israel. I want to basically what I'm gonna talk about right now is the main what I think is the main contention or the main argument of Udi, and I want to place him individually within what I think is a long tradition in the Israeli left. So sort of something more broad and at the same time something more specific to Udi and what he says. So before I start to rejoin the details of Adiv's ideological intervention, I want to take a longer historical view on the uniquely his understanding of Zionism. The history of the left in Palestine, Israel, is marked by its complex and at times ambivalent relations with Zionism. The early communists in Palestine, Israel, emerged out of the far left of labor Zionism, many of them integrating enthusiasm with the new Soviet state with a radical interpretation of the thought of the Marxist-Leninist thinker Dov Ber-Borochov. By 1924, the Palestine Communist Party, PKP as they known, joined the transnational organization of communist parties, the Comintern. The party reformed itself as anti-Zionist. However, throughout the history of official communism in Palestine, Israel, the Jewish members of the party have tried to accommodate forms of Jewish nationalism into the internationalist metrics of the party. In the 1920s, this tendency took the form of Yeshuvism. This doctrine developed from 1924 to roughly 1928, when the Soviets disqualified it, argued that Zionism hindered the capitalist development of Palestine because of two factors. One, it maintained feudal relations in the Palestinian countryside, enabling land acquisition by the Zionists. Two, Zionism allied with British imperialism that wanted to maintain Palestine as a colonial market for finished goods from the metropolitan, further throwing the country's capitalist development. According to the PKP, the Jewish masses should join in an anti-imperialist struggle with the Palestinians, getting themselves rid of the fetters of the development of capitalism, ultimately leading to a socialist revolution. Another manifestation of the attempt to engage with Zionism by the left was the Communist Educational Union in Eretz Israel, known as Communistim Ivrim, or in Hebrew Communists, that tried to join together a commitment to Zionism, or more precisely, a Jewish national home, and communism. Another manifestation of the desire to accommodate forms of Jewish national identity can be found in the work of Moshe Sneh. In his book, so wonderfully entitled Sikumim B'She'ela Ha'Leumit L'or HaMarxism-Leninism, or On the National Questions, Conclusion in the Light of Marxism-Leninism, Sneh prefigured the rejection of Zionism in favor of Marxist anti-Zionism. Sneh uses Stalin theoretization of the nation as constituted by four markers: shared territory, language, economy, and culture, to denationalize the Jewish people while nationalizing the Jews of Israel, meaning the Jews in Israel are a nation, the Jews, let's say in Canada, are just Jews. That's what they are. They're a religious community. By doing that, Sneh can call for Israeli patriotism that profess loyalty to the state while negating its Zionist ideology. The attempt to understand and make space for a form of Israeli Jewish identity can be found even in the radically anti-Zionist Israeli socialist organization, Matzpen, known more by a newspaper named Matzpen. Matzpen advocated, in contrast to the Palestinian organizations on the left, for the self-determination of the Hebrew nation, albeit not in a Jewish state. This ideological stand emerged out of Maki, the Israeli Communist Party ideology that recognized, much like Sneh, Israeli Jews' nationhood. It also emerged from the Canaanite movement, who wished to detach the Jews of Eretz Israel from diaspora Jews and argue for a Hebrew nation linked to the ancient Canaanites, circles from which Matzpen emerged or aroused. Adiv argues that the history of the Zionist movement is a story with an unhappy ending. The story was begotten by a vision of establishing an ideal Jewish society. It ended in bloody conflict, followed by an ongoing war against the local Palestinian people. The fault of the tragic story of Zionism he hangs on the inherent inconsistency of the Zionist idea itself. Like the Greek tragedies, it can be regarded as a necessary failure in the face of necessity. The incongruity is that of the idea of Zionism as the talos of century-long galut, exile, and the reality of Zionism as the here and now as a colonial project. For Adiv, Zionist socialism is beveiled by an intrinsic contradiction between its original utopian content and colonial reality. Here I agree with Adiv that historically, the Zionist left lived in a tragic contradiction between socialist ideals and the realities of settling another people's land. However, in contrast, I argue that the seeds of the tragedy that Zionism meted out on the Palestinian people is encoded in Zionism itself, even if in its left-wing version, as an ideology that privileged Jews. While the ideals of Hashomer HaTzair, Poalei Zion Small, Workers of Zion Left, and other leftist formations were no doubt humanist and socialist, they carried a strong affinity to Jewish nationalism. In other words, the tragedy is not of socialist Zionism contradiction between ideology and practice, but is inherent within its ideology. One clear example is Hashomer HaTzair. At its origin in post-World War I Central Europe, the movement was heavily influenced by the anarchism of philosopher Martin Buber and Pyotr Kropotkin, and the socialism of Gustav Landauer. However, from 1924 onward, it developed a Marxist Zionist ideology formulated by 1927 in the two-stage theory. Zionism was defined in this theory the complete rehabilitation of the Hebrew people by the establishment of a socialist society in Eretz Israel, which will be realized in two stages. One, establishment of the Hebrew national home in Eretz Israel on an independent economic basis. And two, the socialist revolution. The socialist stage was defined in Marxist terms. The new socialist society will be built upon the training and education of the working class towards the seizure of power and the management of the economy and production on the one hand, and destruction of the on the one hand, and the destruction of the existing order on the other hand. Despite the Marxist rhetoric invoked, the two-stage theory was able in reality to indefinitely postpone the realization of the socialist revolutionary state. We are still waiting for a socialist revolution, while Israel is conveniently very capitalist. Hashomer HaTzair and its settlement movement and successive political parties concentrated on achieving nationalist aims in the 1930s and 1940s, subordinating their Marxism to their Zionism. These strengths on the national, while postponing the revolutionary implicitly post-national stage to an undefined future, enabled the kibbutzim of Hashomer HaTzair to take their share in the spoils of the 1948 war. Noga Kadmon shows how even though the kibbutzim constituted ideologically motivated communities of socialist convictions, and their members often discussed questions of values, justice, equality, and morality among themselves, they found justification for their presence on stolen land. For instance, in Kibbutz Sasa, populated in 1949 by North American members of Hashomer HaTzair on the destroyed Palestinian village of Sasa, the members engage in probing moral debate about the morality of their act of settlement. Still, the dominant Zionist ideology, which sees Judaizing the land as the inconvertible goal and reject any alternative, such as binational arrangement espoused by the political movement which the kibbutz was affiliated with, was taken up wholesale by the members of Sasa and overruled all their doubts and qualms. Before we look at ideological and practical readings of socialist Zionism, we see a clear tendency. Therefore, when we look at the ideological and practical readings of socialist Zionism, we see a clear tendency towards Zionism, an inclination that overruled any socialist, internationalist, and humanist content those movements brought with them from revolutionary thought. In the end, the Zionism of labor Zionism This allowed it from effecting a revolution that would articulate the enlightened and idealistic aspect it may have had at its origins. Adiv uses his innovative criticism to paint a more nuanced picture of Zionist settler colonialism. The first to use colonialism, and I'm repeating a little bit things that Udi said, to characterize the Zionist project were Palestinian and anti-Zionist Jewish Marxists. They were followed by the groundbreaking work of Gershon Shafir, 1989, Land, Labor, and the Origins of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. Zionism is described in those works as a movement aimed at controlling the labor market and land to create a pure settler colony for Jews only. Adiv accepts the basic premise of depicting Zionism as a colonial movement. However, his understanding of Zionist colonialism is more nuanced. Zionism, says Adiv, aroused from a handful of Jewish intellectuals, disillusioned by the prospect of the Jews to integrate into a democratized Russia. They adopted the idea of a Jewish romantic nationalism in the image of Russian Slavic nationalism. This organic nationalism of blood and soil, originating in Germany as a reaction to the Republican inclusive nationalism of the French Revolution, had a limited emancipatory effect on the idea of Jewish national revival. However, the main difficulty was the attempt to implement it in mandatory Palestine in the first half of the 20th century. There, the ideas of Jewish nationalism have turned into a colonial practice, disinheriting the Palestinian natives. In contrast to Adiv, I argue that the discursive world from which early Zionism emerged was not solely or even primarily shaped by Eastern and Central European nationalist discourse. Zionism found ready-made images and tools to deal with the native population of Palestine in European colonialism. This process is described by the American Middle East scholar Zachary Lockman. Lockman starts his argument by saying that despite the family resemblance between Zionism and the small nation nationalism of the Poles, Ukrainians and other Jews were not a majority population in any given territory. As such, the primary imperative of Zionism was to be not simply a conventional nationalist movement, but a colonizing and settlement movement as well. Focusing on Palestine as at an early stage, Zionism set to settle an inhabited land. And for that, Zionists use, as Lockman put it, with appropriate modifications, European colonial systems of representation. However, the colonial discourse underlying the Zionist project was not confined to early middle-class Zionists, but also to the left of the Zionist movement. Lockman analyzes the early ideological fathers of Zionist socialism and show how they have adopted to the colonial discourse of other non-socialist Zionists. For instance, Nachman Sirkin, the first significant ideologue of labor Zionism, shared the dominant Zionist representation of Palestine's Arabs as invisible or marginal. The same goes for Bar Borochov, that like most early Zionists, was certain that the country's inhabitants presently did not, and for the foreseeable future, would not constitute a coherent or distinct community. This willful colonial unknowing of early socialist Zionism shows that colonialism was at the roots of their national project. It is not the product of the practice of Zionism in a colonial country, but was present in the ideological world from which Zionism emerged. When the socialist Zionist settlers created the kibbutzot and later kibbutzim, together with their humanist and socialist values, a strong colonial content was present. Adiv intervention is not just theoretical, but offers a political vision that will move Arabs and Jews beyond Zionism. This vision is linked to his criticism of Marxism. In his epilogue to the autobiography of the Palestinian communist Bulus Farah, Adiv sees the historical failure of the Palestinian Communist Party, PKP, as motivated by being torn between Palestinian nationalism and Zionism. This ideological and political dead end originates from a lacuna in the attitude of the Marxist theory itself to the national movement. to the national movement. To substitute the fallen Marxist God, Adiv offers a form of an inclusive Republican virtue, one rooted in the traditions of the French Revolution and the Jacobins. Politically, this virtue will be concretized in a state where Arabs and Jews can become equal citizens in their own Republican state. The inspiration to create such a state and to transform beyond the existing Zionist Israeli existence is the same enlightened spiritual element that existed in the Zionist thought and is still hidden within Israeli society. A critique of this petty bourgeoisie radical notion is found in the same Marxist concept Adiv rejects. In his short history of Israeli Marxism, Amir argues, there is a common thread running through Zionist and Israeli political Marxism. Amir maintains that different local variants of Marxism are not just elaboration of a general theory. Rather, they are the transformation of the general theory itself. Marxism, at its most universal in the Chinese revolutionary situation, for example, is Maoism. Therefore, Marxism manifests itself historically differently, yet as an expression of the universal theory, universal revolutionary as a whole. Marxism is the same if it is Maoism or in all kinds of Israeli versions that we're going to talk shortly about. Therefore, once in the Zionist Marxism of Ber Borochov, and later as the anti-Zionist support for Palestinian self-determination by Tamar Grojansky. Therefore, it can be argued that the explanatory force behind the struggle for a one state is in a materialistic dialectic contradiction and not the original humanist spirit of Zionist socialism. Is Adiv arguments as they unfold here before us just another reincarnation of the intellectual tradition I opened my remarks with? The answer is less of a binary of yes or no. Adiv is most certainly attempting to accommodate nationalism to a universalist framework. However, while others on the left attempted to articulate specific Jewish and Palestinian nationalism, Adiv offers us a national identity that transforms beyond those particular identities. It is a bold and thought-provoking offer, and we should consider it seriously. Thank you very much. And I assume we are going now into questions. Come on.
Thank you so much, Amir. Actually, we got a question put in a while ago by Elizabeth Block from IGV Toronto that ties in with a lot of what you just presented, but I guess the comment is for both of you, Amir and Udi. Elizabeth says, I did not know that the Zionists had tried a plantation model. I do know that they would like to copy the model of American Indian reservation because an Israeli official said so to someone I know. Do you have any knowledge of analysis of that?
Udi first.
I don't have any knowledge. Recently I wrote try to make some comparison between United States and Israel and Zionism. So one of someone argued against me that the Americans don't have 1 million Indians in California, like just like the Israeli does with the Palestinian in Gaza. So I said they don't put the 1 million Indian in California because they already killed them. So Zionism, the main thing with Zionism is that whatever Zionists did toward the Palestinian, and it's a lot of horrible things that they're still doing in daily terms. But the question is, there was no such a thing as the Zionism, and it's still today. You should refer to certain people, certain ideas, certain parties, certain political and social classes or whatever, or social group. And between the left and right, between now we have a really fascist party in Israel, really, if not more than fascist. Yeah? Still, so and you cannot, overcome this or ignore this internal contradiction and define Zionism as such, or Israel as such, or the Jewish people in Israel, or the Jewish society as such. There isn't such a thing. There isn't such a thing as Jewish community, Jewish society. It's an empty group. There is Israeli society like every other society, which is relatively still have some possibility to function, to argue, to fight for its idea. Semi-democratic, 1/4 democratic, but still lots of possibility to act politically. And that's it. And what they think about the Palestinian, it's every party has its own idea about what to do with the Palestinian.
Thank
Okay.
you. Sorry.
Okay, to the plantation model first. The plantation model is developed and it is limited to what we call the first aliyah. I'm going to give kind of a historical answer. To the first aliyah from a certain state, after they tried to use only Jewish labor and failed, turned into a plantation where there is, when there is a class of native workers and a class of settler foremen, okay? And that's really, it's almost conscious because the main benefactor of those Jewish settlements in the early 19th century, in the late 19th century and early 20th century is Baron de Rothschild, and he brings with him ideas and notions that come from French Algeria. And he says that the same in French Algeria, where European French settlers have this kind of plantation economy, will have the same in Palestine. Okay, colonialism back then is not a dirty word. It is for Europeans. It's completely permissible to talk this way, think this way, and act this way. So the Jews in Palestine are not different from any other Europeans in this case. As for the reservation idea, we can look at the, and I'm not making a very deep analysis here, but we can look at the occupation as it is now with the Palestinian Authority and those Palestinian enclaves, including Gaza, this prison in Gaza, self-managed kind of prisons, those enclaves, as basically reservation, as the reservation system in the United States, where you take those, the native ethnic group and you put her there. So there is this this resemblance. You have to make much more analysis to convince me that it's the same. It is conscious on the part of Israelis to do that. You need to look at it further, but you're right. There is some resemblance there. Okay. Yeah.
I have a question from another participant, and this one is, I guess, directly to Udi, asking, is the government of Israel making your life difficult? And I had a second follow-up question, knowing that you spent quite a few years in prison. I'm interested, we know a little bit more about the narrative of Palestinians in the Israeli prison system. I'm wondering, what's your perspective? And sort of like you said, you read and you studied. What else did you do? What else did you see?
Oh, prison was a university for me. I studied 16 hours a day, reading, arguing, discussing, learning Arabic. But by the way, I wrote my autobiography. It was going to be published in Hebrew very soon. So if you try to translate it. But my remember of this period was certainly not negative. It's quite, certainly in hindsight, after the events, it was quite very, also personally, because young people don't take life seriously, even revolutionary. And prison force you to start to think about your life, about what is really matter in life, and that's it, more or less. Yes. But the main thing as a political person, of course, it's my discussion with a Palestinian. It was very, very unique, very, I mean, that actually I realized I achieved my my ideas, my revolutionary idea in prison, not outside prison. We have to make it with the Palestinian, not separately.
Thank you so much, Udi. I'm impressed because we're 20 minutes over time and we still have more than half people who join us, who are still on the call. So that just testifies to the fact that this conversation is really of interest, and I'm glad that folks stuck around. However, I want to be respectful of Udi's time because it's getting late. So we will take maybe one more question before wrapping up. Does anybody, I don't have anything coming up next in the chat, but is there anybody who is interested in a final question or comment, either to Udi or Amir, or both of them? Go ahead, Ian. Hold on, let us unmute you or unmute yourself. There you go.
Hello. Well, first thing I want to say, Udi, is that I'm very glad to see what you look like these days. Sylvia Klingberg's a very good friend of mine, as indeed was Marek Klingberg. In fact, before he went to prison. But I don't want to go into personal things. What I did want to ask you was, prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, the efforts were being made by Sylvia to arrange a spy swap between her father and someone spying for the other side. And I'm just interested in any observations you have on the relationship between the, let's call it the liberation movement of Palestinians and the Soviet Union, because I believe that I remember there being criticism of Sylvia for working with the Soviets to arrange this swap. Do you have, you may not want to go into this at all, but do you have any observations just on the association, the interest that existed among Israeli left groups and the relationship with the Soviet Union?
I think the Israeli left group, it's mainly you refer to the communist parties, that they were very pro-Soviets and very close relation, long time relationship with the Soviets until their collapse. But Sylvia was belonged to Matzpen at the time, and then in France to the Trotskyists. They were the people who criticized very much strongly Soviet Union as not leftist criticism of the Soviet Union, that they are not enough Marxist and they are not applied Marxism, Leninism as such, and certainly also toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that they are compromised. It's not revolutionary. They are not 100% support the Palestinian, but try to find always this kind of Oslo and solution, negotiation, peace. They have the communists with the Soviet to stay for two people. And by that you related to this some exchange of that Israel at last, or the American, how somehow it didn't complete it. But this, I don't think at the time that there was someone in Israel involved in one way or another in this affair. And certainly the leftists in Israel, there was some other group of so-called post-Zionists, there are Shelley, Moked, some other leftist groups. They're very careful not to say a word about Klingberg and Sylvia, and stayed outside it completely, not to be involved in this. By the way, there is this the affair of the arrest of the prison terms and the trial of Klingberg was a secret until the mid-90s. Nobody in Israel, except people who were involved and close to Sylvia, knew about it. So it's not really, was not the case. So in Israeli left.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. We got to wrap it up for this evening. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you so much, Udi and Amir, for presenting today. This was wonderful. We recorded this, so there will be a video, for folks